I didn't know then that a simple camping trip would redraw the lines of my life. Looking back, I can pinpoint the exact moment everything shifted, not in a dramatic confession or a reckless act, but in a quiet exchange that felt heavier than it should have. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Now, I know it was the beginning. That my name is Ethan, and I agreed to the trip because saying no felt harder than going. My older brother Mark had been planning a weekend camping getaway with a few of his close friends, men he'd known since college. When one of them canceled last minute, Mark asked if I wanted to fill the spot. He said it casually, like it was no big deal. For me, it was an escape. I'd recently ended a relationship that never truly began, another almost love that left me feeling unseen. The idea of disappearing into the woods for a few days sounded like relief. We arrived at the campsite just before sunset. Tall trees surrounded the clearing, their shadows stretching long and patient across the ground. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and for the first time in weeks, my mind slowed down. Mark was in his element, confidently organizing tents and assigning tasks. I watched him laugh with his friends, wondering when we'd grown so different. He belonged everywhere he stood. I often felt like a guest in my own life. That's when I noticed Lucas that he wasn't loud like some of the others, nor was he trying to impress anyone. Lucas moved with a quiet ease, stepping in to help without being asked. When our eyes met, he smiled, simple, genuine, unguarded. It caught me off balance. Mark introduced us properly, though Lucas and I had technically met before. This time felt different, as if we were actually seeing each other. As night settled in, the campsite transformed. A fire crackled at the center, its glow softening faces and blurring edges. Conversation flowed easily, fueled by shared stories and the comfort of familiarity, comfort I didn't fully share. I stayed mostly quiet, listening, until Lucas sat beside me. He asked about my job, my move back to town, things Mark never bothered to ask. His attention felt deliberate, and I found myself answering honestly without overthinking it. Later, Mark asked Lucas and me to gather firewood from the edge of the clearing. It was a small task, ordinary and harmless. We walked side by side, the forest thickening around us, the sounds of the group fading behind. Lucas mentioned how peaceful it was out there, how rare it felt to be away from expectations. I agreed, surprised by how easily the conversation deepened. He spoke about feeling stuck, about living a life that looked right from the outside but felt incomplete. I didn't interrupt. I understood that feeling too well. There was no sudden spark, no dramatic realization. Just a quiet recognition, like discovering a shared language you didn't know existed. When we returned to the campsite, our arms brushed briefly. It was accidental, fleeting, but it lingered longer in my mind than it should have. That night, lying in my tent, sleep refused to come. I could hear Mark laughing from the fire, the low murmur of voices, the steady rhythm of nature around us. My thoughts kept circling back to Lucas, his honesty, the way he listened, the ease of being understood without explanation. I reminded myself of the obvious boundaries. He was my brother's friend. He had a life I knew nothing about. Whatever this feeling was, it was temporary. The next morning confirmed how wrong that assumption was. Lucas made coffee early, handing me a mug before I even asked. We shared a quiet moment watching the fog lift, neither of us speaking, yet both fully present. Mark joined us eventually, breaking the silence, but something had already been established. A connection, subtle, unspoken, and dangerous in its simplicity. As the day unfolded, I became aware of how often Lucas and I gravitated toward each other. It wasn't intentional. It just happened. Each shared glance, each half-finished sentence, built on the last. I felt a tension growing beneath the surface, not urgent, but persistent. It made me uneasy, and curious. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees once more, I realized this trip was no longer just an escape. It was a crossroads. I didn't know which direction it would force me to choose, only that pretending nothing was happening would soon become impossible, and that was what scared me most. The second visit to Daniel Harris's office felt different because this time, I went on my own. I told myself I needed advice about college applications, something practical and harmless. Still, my pulse betrayed me as I knocked, and when he looked up from his desk and smiled in recognition, the room seemed to settle around us like a held breath. "Ethan," Daniel said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I was hoping you'd come back." That single sentence warmed and unsettled me at the same time. We spoke about universities, essays, futures that sounded impressive when said aloud. Yet the conversation drifted, as it always did, toward what lay underneath. He asked what I wanted, not what was expected of me. I struggled to answer. Wanting felt dangerous, it implied choice. Days turned into a pattern. I stopped by after school under reasonable excuses, forms, recommendations, questions I could have asked anyone. Daniel never questioned my presence. His office became quieter in the afternoons, sunlight slanting across the carpet, the world outside thinning to a distant hum. In that quiet, words came easier. I told him about the restlessness that followed me everywhere, about pretending to be certain when I felt anything, but Daniel listened the way he always did, his attention steady, his responses measured. Sometimes he shared pieces of himself, nothing improper, just the edges of a life lived carefully. He spoke of responsibility, of choosing the right thing even when it cost you. When he mentioned Laura, his wife, it was with respect and a practiced gentleness. The mention grounded him, reminded us both of lines already drawn. At home, Ryan Miller noticed my distraction. She asked if I was stressed, if I wanted to talk. I said yes and meant no. I held her hand and felt the distance between us widen, invisible but undeniable. The guilt arrived quietly, trailing me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I wasn't doing anything wrong, I told myself. Not really. Yet I was giving someone else the parts of me she deserved. One afternoon, rain streaked the office windows, blurring the campus into gray shapes. Daniel closed a folder and leaned back, studying me with an expression I couldn't read. "You don't have to have it all figured out," he said. "Some questions take time." "I don't know who I am without everyone else's expectations," I admitted. The confession slipped out before I could stop it. Saying it felt like stepping off a ledge and finding solid ground. Daniel nodded slowly. "That uncertainty doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest." The silence that followed was charged, not with desire, but with recognition. We were two people standing too close to a truth neither of us could safely claim. I became acutely aware of his hands resting on the desk, of the careful distance he maintained. He was controlling the space between us, and I was grateful and resentful in equal measure. As weeks passed, the boundary blurred not through action but through reliance. When something unsettled me, I wanted to tell Daniel first. When he looked tired, I felt responsible for the weight he carried. That realization frightened me. Emotional dependence was quieter than any rule-breaking, harder to name, easier to excuse. The moment it almost broke came unexpectedly. I stood to leave, and Daniel reached out, stopping just short of my wrist. The gesture froze us both. His hand hovered, then fell back to his side as if burned. He turned away, breath unsteady. "This can't go further," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not because it doesn't matter, but because it does." I nodded, though the words stung. I wanted him to deny what we both felt, to tell me I'd imagined it. Instead, he acknowledged it and set it aside, a decision that cost him something visible. When I left, the rain had stopped, and the campus smelled clean, washed of its earlier gloom. That night, Ryan fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, trusting, unafraid. I stared into the dark, aware that nothing had changed and everything had. I had crossed a line without stepping over it, and I didn't know how to go back. What I knew was this: restraint didn't erase connection. It only sharpened it. As I drifted toward sleep, one thought kept me awake. If this was the moment we chose to stop, why did it feel like the beginning? The change was subtle at first, the kind you could explain away if you wanted to. Daniel Harris stopped inviting conversation beyond what was necessary. His door, once open in the afternoons, stayed shut more often than not. When I passed his office, he offered a polite nod instead of a smile, as if we were returning borrowed familiarity without comment. I told myself this was relief. I told myself it was right, but distance has its own weight. Without the quiet refuge of those conversations, my thoughts grew louder. School felt sharper, less forgiving. I caught myself glancing toward his office during breaks, then looking away, embarrassed by the habit. What we hadn't done echoed louder than anything we had. Ryan Miller noticed the shift before I admitted it to myself. She asked why I seemed far away, why I flinched when she reached for me unexpectedly. I tried to be present. I tried to repair what I hadn't fully broken. But honesty, once delayed, becomes heavier to carry. When she asked if there was someone else, I said no. It wasn't a lie that comforted me. Rumors moved faster than truth. Someone mentioned my frequent visits to the office, framed as curiosity rather than accusation. I felt heat rise to my face, fear prickling at the edges of my composure. Daniel never addressed it directly, but the carefulness in his demeanor deepened. He was protecting something, his position, his marriage, perhaps even me. The realization complicated my resentment. The final conversation happened on an ordinary afternoon. I had rehearsed my words, but they scattered when he looked up and met my eyes. "I need to understand," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Was any of it real?" Daniel closed the file he was working on and gestured for me to sit. The formality hurt more than anger would have. He took a moment before answering, choosing truth without indulgence. "It was real," he said. "And that's why it had to stop." He spoke of responsibility, of the lives entangled with his choices. He didn't mention Laura by name this time, but her presence filled the room. "Caring doesn't give us permission," he added. "Sometimes it's the opposite." I listened, absorbing the words I hadn't wanted but needed. He wasn't dismissing what we shared. He was placing it where it belonged, in the past tense. When I stood to leave, he offered a final kindness. "You're going to be okay, Ethan," he said. "Don't let this define you." Graduation came and went. The ceremony blurred into applause and photographs, smiles stretched thin with anticipation. I said goodbye to Ryan with apologies that felt both overdue and insufficient. She accepted them with grace I hadn't earned. As I left the campus for the last time, I didn't look toward the principal's office. I already knew what it held. Years later, distance softened the edges of memory without erasing its shape. I learned to name myself without borrowing certainty from others. I learned that intimacy doesn't always announce itself with touch, sometimes it arrives as understanding, and that can be just as dangerous. When I think of Daniel now, I don't frame him as a villain or a savior. He was a man who chose restraint, and a boy who learned what choice costs. What happened after I went to his office didn't ruin my life. It rearranged it. It taught me that boundaries matter because feelings do, too, and that crossing one doesn't require a single step. Some doors close quietly, leaving you changed enough to notice the silence, and even now, when I pass a familiar hallway or hear a door click shut behind me, I remember how easily everything can begin.
I used to believe that stability was the same as happiness. That if two people shared a home, shared history, and shared a last name, then whatever silence filled the rooms between them was normal. I held on to that belief the way one holds onto a railing in the dark, out of habit, not certainty. My name is Ethan Cole, and before the warehouse, I thought my life was already decided. Mark and I had been married for 5 years. From the outside, we looked solid, two men who had survived the difficult beginnings, built careers, and settled into a quiet neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. Inside our house, however, conversations had thinned into logistics. We spoke about groceries, bills, and weekend plans we rarely followed through on. When I asked Mark how his day was, he answered without lifting his eyes from his phone. When he asked me the same, it felt like courtesy rather than curiosity. I told myself this was adulthood. I told myself love matured into something quieter. Still, there were evenings when Mark came home late, smelling of rain or traffic, and passed by me without noticing the effort I had made to stay awake. On those nights, I sat alone on the couch, listening to the hum of appliances, wondering when exactly I had started to feel invisible. Lucas Reed lived 2 houses down from us. I noticed him the way one notices a fixed point on the horizon, present, steady, and unexplained. He owned a warehouse at the edge of the neighborhood, a wide concrete structure with no sign, no windows facing the street, and a reputation for being permanently locked. Lucas himself was polite but reserved. Our interactions rarely went beyond a nod or a brief exchange about the weather. Yet there was something careful about him, as though he measured his words before releasing them into the world. Mark barely acknowledged Lucas. "He's quiet," Mark said once, shrugging. "Probably likes it that way." The comment ended there, filed away with other observations that didn't require further thought. I, however, found myself noticing small details: how Lucas always returned borrowed tools promptly, how he never lingered, how his eyes carried the look of someone used to being alone. The warehouse stood behind a rusted gate, its walls stained by time and dust. I passed it often during my evening walks, drawn to its stillness. It felt separate from the rest of the neighborhood, like a secret no one asked about because no one wanted to be responsible for opening it. I didn't know why I thought about it as much as I did. Maybe because locked places invite imagination. Maybe because I, too, felt closed off from something unnamed. One evening, as I was trimming the hedge in front of our house, Lucas approached me. He moved quietly, and I didn't hear him until he spoke my name. His voice was calm, almost hesitant. "Ethan," he said, "I was wondering if you could help me with something." I straightened, surprised by the directness. "Sure," I replied, though I had no idea what he needed. He explained that he was reorganizing part of the warehouse and could use an extra pair of hands. His words were practical, his tone neutral, but there was a pause afterward, as if he expected me to refuse. I thought of Mark inside the house, likely absorbed in emails. I thought of my evening stretching ahead, empty and predictable. "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow," Lucas said. "If you're free." I told him I was. The answer came too quickly, surprising even me. Lucas nodded, thanked me, and walked away without further explanation. I watched him go, aware of a faint, unfamiliar anticipation settling in my chest. That night, Mark and I ate dinner side by side, barely exchanging words. I mentioned that I had agreed to help Lucas at his warehouse. Mark looked up briefly, then returned his attention to his plate. "Sounds fine," he said. "Don't stay out too late. I've got an early meeting." There was no question, no curiosity. I realized that if I hadn't said anything at all, Mark might never have noticed my absence. The thought lingered long after we went to bed, lying between us like an unspoken truth. The next afternoon arrived with a pale sky and the kind of quiet that made every sound feel amplified. As I walked toward the warehouse, I noticed Mrs. Helen Brooks watering her plants across the street. She paused, watching me with gentle interest. "Helping Lucas today?" she asked. I nodded. "Just for a bit." She smiled, as if she knew something I didn't, and returned to her flowers. Her gaze stayed with me longer than necessary, and I felt an odd sense of being observed, as though the neighborhood itself had taken note of my small decision. The warehouse gate creaked when I pushed it open. The building loomed closer now, its surface rough beneath my fingertips. Lucas was waiting by the door, keys in hand. He looked relieved when he saw me, though he masked it quickly. "Thanks for coming," he said. "Of course," I replied. As he unlocked the door, I felt a hesitation I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear, exactly, but awareness, the sense that stepping inside would mean stepping away from something familiar. I thought of Mark again, of the life we had built, and of how solid it appeared from the outside. I wondered if one afternoon could truly threaten all of that. The door opened with a hollow echo. Dust and cool air spilled out, carrying the faint scent of metal and old wood. Lucas gestured for me to enter, standing aside as if granting permission rather than giving instruction. I took one last look back at the street, at the ordinary houses and quiet sidewalks, then crossed the threshold. The door closed behind me, and the sound lingered longer than it should have, echoing in my mind. I didn't know it yet, but the moment I stepped inside that warehouse, the careful balance of my life had already begun to shift.